It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce John Smol to Waterloo. He's a great friend of University of Waterloo and a frequent visitor. He's given numerous talks in the last several years here. And I think his last visit before coming to give this talk was to receive an honorary doctorate at a fall convocation of 2012. So he is indeed a dear friend to University of Waterloo, and really pleased that he could come and give this talk to us today. I think many people in this audience know John quite well, and some of them got introduced to him at a talk he gave to the biology department yesterday, but let me make sure that everybody gets a quick introduction to him. He's a professor of biology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he holds a Canada Research Chair in Environmental Change. He began as a professor there in 1984, so about 30 years ago, and founded a lab that he has the acronym PEARL. It stands for Paleo Ecological Environmental Research and Assessment Laboratory, which is a pretty sizable unit, 30 people at a time, students and postdocs. So he is well funded and supports many people. As he says, writes the checks for lots of people and edits a tremendous amount of thesis and chapters and so on. That group is dedicated to the study of long-term environmental change at a global scale and has a real focus on the Arctic as well as a number of pressing environmental issues that he'll tell us about today. He's achieved quite a lot in his 30 years as a university professor, and there's more than I can, his CV is super thick, and let me just highlight a few of those things. In 1996, he was elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, so he's been quite a long-standing and active member in the Royal Society. In 2004, he received NSERC's top prize, or prizes for the top scientist or engineer, known as the Hertzberg Medal, gold medal. In 2010, along with his brother, who's a professor at University of Ottawa, were chosen by the Canadian Geographic Society as Canada's Environmental Scientists of the Year. And in 2013, our former president, President Johnson, now Governor General Award, gave him named him Order of Canada, or Officer of the Order of Canada, which is our country's highest civilian honor. Many other things that I could name here, but I also want to point out that along the way he's picked up at least 10 awards for his skills as a teacher and mentor and service areas of achievement, including a 3M Teaching Award at a national scale, numerous, I think, university awards, and I think most recently along these was Nature magazine did a search for the top mentor, a graduate student mainly, or research student mentor at a national level, and at Canada they identified John as the best mentor. So a really glowing example that the best researchers are often the best teachers and the best mentors. So just before I give the stage to John to give us a talk where he's going to talk about his science of using lake sediment records to address environmental issues, I want to point out that we actually have a pretty rapid series of 3 talks through the Water Institute. A week from today, we have Charles Vorismarty coming to this room at the same time. And the following Tuesday, we have Dr. Sheila Olmsted. So if you don't have those on your agenda, please add them. And without any further ado, I'll let John take the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's always very nice to be back at Waterloo, and I met a few of you yesterday when I gave a talk in the biology department. And I should apologize before I start. A few of my introductory slides will be very similar to the talk I gave yesterday for about the 10 of you, I think, who perhaps were at both talks. Once I get into the talk proper, though, the focus will be quite different. Yesterday I spoke about biological responses to human impacts in lakes, primarily in Ontario and Nova Scotia. Today I'm going to be talking more specifically about sort of a Canadian issue dealing with the Alberta oil sands region, and looking primarily at some of the chemical issues that are dealing with that operation. And again, this will, just like yesterday, this will be a collaborative effort. Although I'm here talking, much of the work was done by, of course, very dedicated postdocs and graduate students. as well as close colleagues in Environment Canada in this case, including people like Derek Muir and Jane Kirk and Zhao Wang over at the Burlington CCIW facility, and also Marlene Evans farther out west in Saskatchewan, who did some of the work as well. So it's obviously a group effort that the examples are going to be talking about. But what I am going to be, first I'm just going to give an introduction of what I think is one of the critical things missing in a lot of environmental work, which is the lack of a historical perspective. And as my title suggests, I'm going to be talking about exploring the past to help protect our future. And primarily I'm going to be looking at lake sediments and using the main example in this case of work in the oil sands region. As I mentioned yesterday, we live in very difficult times when we deal with the environment. We, as you know, geologists divide world history into different epochs and periods. We're getting, geologists or stratigraphers are getting close to defining a new geologic era called the Anthropocene, or the period of where humans dominated Earth history. There's still a little bit of discussion of where that line, that new geological line, is going to be drawn. There's been some recent publications. I frankly thought it would be drawn around 1850 in that area. Some had suggested the 1700s, the start of the steam engine. But there seems to be some convergence coming on about 1950 or thereabouts, when things really, or so-called the great acceleration in human impacts. Regardless of where that final period comes, humans are now the dominant force on this planet. They move more Earth than the natural processes. We've learned how to change the physics and the chemistry characteristics of our atmosphere. And as we know, they've also been changing the water in many different ways due to our activities. We are a major force on the planet right now. And also, we have to start realizing that the world's a very complicated place. We live in a multiple stressor world. Many things are happening simultaneously. We know that, for example, if you look at water issues, and this audience certainly doesn't need a reminder of that, but we're affecting the water in many different ways. We're adding point source pollution still in some areas. We have more like diffuse sources of pollution, like, for example, coming from agriculture or from our lawns. And of course that, lakes are downhill, rivers are downhill. That's where a lot of the pesticides and the nutrients may go. Everything from dredging to oil spills to other types of direct impacts into our water systems. We also started realizing that the world is not as simple as just going through water. A lot of the pollutants and a lot of things we deal with are traveled by air currents, by the wind. We're polluting the atmosphere, which eventually, usually what goes up comes down. And I talked about some of those issues even yesterday when I talked about some long-term effects of acid rain and how that's affected other types of the ecosystem. But we're sending pollutants up into the atmosphere, and eventually those pollutants come down and hit our waterways and affect our ecosystems. And on top of that, what I call the big threat multiplier is human-induced climate change. I think this is a very, very serious problem. And very often there are cumulative or synergistic changes that are happening. When I look at many of the issues like with climate change, you would think that eventually, well, some climate change will make some problems worse, some problems better. It seems every problem I work on, when you put it in a warmer planet, the problems are worse. And it really is a pretty wicked problem we're dealing with, and we're not dealing with it very effectively. As I mentioned yesterday, when it comes to environmental or ecological work, these are the basic types of questions we typically ask. And I use the analogy of very often environment work is done after the fact, after a problem is identified. It's not too different from human medical conditions, for example. Usually we go to the doctor after we're sick. I use the analogy also like it's like a car accident scene where the police might come to investigate, or a murder scene come to investigate, usually coming after the fact. So you have to reconstruct how you got to that position. The same thing happens with medical histories. You go to a doctor, typically, what are the questions the doctor asks you? The first thing they ask you is a medical history. They're trying to find out, well, a variety of things. They're trying to find out what is the history of your disease, what is your natural baseline reference conditions, to some extent trying to determine if in fact you are sick. Maybe you're not. Maybe what you think you're not well is actually the way you've always been. There's not much differences between that and what we have to do in an environmental issue. We have to know what were pre-disturbance conditions. If we think we have an environmental problem, we have to know what was it like before humans were a major impact to know how big that problem is. Now, there's many examples we can use. One example is simple algal blooms. This part of the world is experiencing some algal blooms in the lakes, and that's obviously a serious issue aesthetically and environmentally. But is maybe algal blooms have been happening there for 12,000 years. Or maybe, how do we know that the algal blooms are related to human activities? We have to know what it was like before farming was there, before different types of fertilizers were used, before human sewage was being dumped into rivers. I used the analogy yesterday of acid rain, a very major issue that we had, and we still have in many ways. Well, you could go to places like Algonquin Park or Halliburton and measure the pH of lakes. No question you could say the lakes were acid. But how do you know acid rain made them acid? You pretty well have to know what the pH of those lakes were like in the 1800s to know that they actually acidified. We need this historical perspective. You want to know what is the range of natural variability. No one can deny something very strange is happening to the climate in the recent past, but the argument has been made that, that's just part of some natural long-term cycle, or it's following the sun or something like that. Again, you need a long-term perspective to put those types of answers into proportion. Have conditions changed? How much, how fast, when? Every question I'm asking here needs long-term data, needs some sort of long-term monitoring data. This is one of the biggest challenges we have in environmental and ecological research. We don't have the data, and the past matters. History is where a lot of these answers are, and we simply were not monitoring. It wasn't because we were lazy. It's because often we didn't even know what to monitor. Often we didn't even know there were problems. And many ways we simply didn't have the technology or the resources to do the monitoring. And the problem is quite severe. We really don't have very good long-term monitoring data. This is a figure for one of my textbooks. And what I did in this figure, I went to the International Journal Environmental Monitoring and Assessment. It's an international journal published in the Netherlands, looks at monitoring programs around the world and publishes their results. I asked the simple question, how long are these long-term monitoring programs? Well, it turns out that if you look at the journals, at least the journal articles I looked at, about 2/3 are less than 1 year in duration, and fully 90% or more are less than 3 years in duration. Now, 3 years is a perfectly respectable time to answer many questions, which I'm sure many of you in the audience are researching. And 3 years is also the typical amount of time you might have on an NSF or an NSERC grant. 3 years be the amount of time we'd expect a PhD student to do his or her field research. It makes sense. But 3 years typically is not enough time to answer many of those questions I posed in the previous slide. It simply is not long enough to get background conditions, natural variability, and so forth. So what we do is we try and push the monitoring record back in time. We can do that in a large number of ways, all of which have some limitations. And I should say, including the methods I'll be talking about today. I should preface this by I'm an enthusiast, so I tend to give you a very rosy view of things. I mean, there are some problems, but we do have independent ways of asserting those problems and studying these problems. They're not, in a talk of 50 minutes long, I can't go into the various ways we've actually assessed the various complicating factors, but they have been assessed extensively. A lot of these types of data are being used to design legislation. A lot of these data I'll be talking about do not make some people happy. They would be nothing happier than to show that these data are wrong. So these data are constantly challenged, and we have a long history of, I think, robustly meeting those challenges, whether coming from other scientists, which of course is part of the scientific process, or coming quite often from what I would argue vested interest groups. But we try and push the record back in time, and there's usually 3 ways people do this. The first one is you try and get whatever historical records are there. Especially in this country, like Canada, with large numbers of native peoples, we often can also use traditional oral knowledge or oral histories. And we do a lot of that work, for example, in the Arctic. And by that I mean, for example, if we want to know what is the record of fish in a lake, well, we will not probably have detailed biological surveys like you do here in the biology department going back to the 1800s. I mean, we just will not have those data. But we will have records, for example, in people's diaries or in fishing clubs of how much fish they caught or what size of fish they caught. And in many northern communities, for example, there'll be history. Well, my grandfather used to catch this type of fish, but we can't find that fish here anymore. This is still important data. Certainly, the farther back you go, the error bars get bigger. Certainly, they might not be following the exact scientific method that you might like. But we do not have the luxury to throw away any data as long as we believe it to be reliable, so we have to use it. The second one I have there is modeling. There's a whole field of modeling, including a lot of it done in this university. We work with modelers. I'm definitely not a modeler, but I work with modelers. And there's ways that people can, we often think of models as forecasting what might happen or scenarios for the future. Of course, models can also be hindcast with some difficulty, but try and reconstruct, for example, what was the pH of lakes before acid rain based on a modeled approach, or what is the natural phosphorus level of a lake, and so on and so forth. What I'm really going to be talking about here today is my last category, which I call natural archives. All around us on this planet are natural archives recording the environment for us. And it comes in many forms. A simple example are the trees outside of this building. The trees are in their tree rings recording some history of the environment, how fast the tree grows, how dense the tree rings are. To some extent, the isotopes and the chemistry of the tree rings can be used to reconstruct an environmental history. If you go to the oceans, you might go to corals in the deep ocean. They too are accumulating a whole field of sclerochronology, accumulating over time, doing a record of what the ocean was like. You go to polar regions, the ice cores are perhaps a good example, or going up high mountains where there's ice caps. People look at the ice cores and go back in time. What I'm going to be talking about here for this specific example, I'm going to look at lake sediments, the material accumulating at the bottom of lakes. Everywhere you see a lake and pond, you have a time machine slowly accumulating information about what happened in that lake and in the surrounding conditions. In many ways, it's something similar to a black box that we have in an airplane. When an airplane goes down, what's the first thing they want to do is get a history of the airplane crash. They're looking for the black box. It's actually not black, but they call it the black box. It's usually red. But they're looking for that to try and reconstruct what happened. Every lake you have has a black box of some sort of record of what's been going on in the past. And the overall procedure is fairly straightforward. I'm a Paleo Limnologist. Well, I'm actually, I self-identify as a limnologist, someone who studies the lakes and rivers, and I use Paleo Limnological approaches. So Paleo Limnology is using lake sediments to reconstruct long-term environmental trends. The overall procedure is quite straightforward. Lakes slowly fill with mud. 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, mud is accumulating at the bottom of lakes. That mud is in general accumulating in a stratified or an organized manner. The deeper you go, the older it is. Of course, it is not a perfect record. There could be some methods of mixing, there could be different levels of preservation. There are independent ways we can look at that. But by and large, a lake is steadily accumulating a history book of what happened outside the lake, a lot of this material coming from outside the lake, things like pollen grains from trees. All the trees out there, different species of trees produce different types of pollen grains. They're very well preserved in lake sediments. By counting the different types of pollen grains going back in history, you can reconstruct how the terrestrial vegetation has changed, for example. There's things like soil particles from erosion. We can do that. One thing I'm going to be talking about a lot today is aerially transported contaminants. They also is sort of a passive sampler monitoring atmospheric deposition that falls on the lake, sinks to the bottom, and gets into this time record. We can also simultaneously look how the lake itself is changing, because virtually everything living in that lake is leaving some sort of morphological or biogeochemical fossil. Morphological things you can see like with a microscope. Biogeochemical is using some sort of chemical technique. And I'll give you a few examples, but virtually everything in that water column is leaving some sort of record. So slowly things accumulate over time, and our job of paleolimnologists is to remove that sediment record, remove a core of that mud, and reconstruct the environment, reconstruct the conditions based on all the information we can get from that history book, and make it accessible to other scientists and the public at large. Now, lakes in this part of the world, they were deglaciated about 12,000 or so years ago. So every lake around here pretty well has about 12,000 year history. Now, in many of our research projects, we want to go back to the Ice Age. We're looking at long-term changes. Now, I'm going to be focusing on the last 150 years. So I'm just going to be looking at the top 50 centimeters of the cores in this example, the examples I'll be showing you here today. And to do that, you have to get a nice detailed record of the last 150 years, 200 years. And like use the analogy yesterday, the sediment at the surface is very watery, very loose. I know many of you have probably walked out when you're swimming in the lake and you see how much you sink into the sediment. Well, it's even worse in the middle of a lake where you get the very fine sediment. It's very close to the consistency, I would say, of like a milkshake. I think it's the closest, if you actually work with a lot of sediments, it often even looks like milkshake material. So if you want to take a core of a milkshake, well, it might not seem that simple, but it's actually not that hard. If you have a milkshake in front of you and have a straw, you put the straw in to a certain point, you put your thumb on top of the straw, you pull it up, you basically take a core of your milkshake. This is more or less the same type of thing that you're doing here. We're lowering, this is the glue core developed by John Glue in my lab. These cores are now used all around the world, but they're focused on taking very carefully the top 50 centimeters or so of sediment. It goes down in the open position. This plunger is in the open position, so you slowly lower it. You don't drop it because you'd blow the sediment away, but you slowly lower it into the sediment to the depth that you want, and you send a lead messenger down the line, and it's like putting your thumb on top of the straw. Then you pull it up, and there's your sediment core, and as you can see, I don't know how well you see it with the lighting, but even in this lake, you can see quite clearly nice layers. You have not disturbed, even though it's a consistency of milkshake, you have not disturbed the sediment profile. So it actually works fairly well. And then once you have the core, like pages in a book, you got to go back in time. The deeper you go, the older it is. Again, we're dealing with very watery sediment here, so we have to be a little careful. But this is just the glue extruder. It's not much to it. You put the sediment core, you have a controlled pusher on the bottom. You're basically pushing from the bottom. In this case, I'm pushing, I think, 1/4 centimeter at a time. And 1/4 centimeter, most lakes in Ontario are going to be about 2 or 3 years of lake history. Every time I go down another 1/4 centimeter, I'll be back about 2 or 3 years of lake history, slowly going back in time. The deeper I go, the older I get. In the sediment is a tremendous library of information that we can use. I'm giving you dates. I'm saying it's 2 or 3 years, and this is about 200 years of sediment. How do I know how old the material is? A critical point is like if you're reading a book, you have to know what page you're on and what the sequence is. So we have to put dates on the sediment. It's one thing to say, I'm at the 20 centimeter level or the 30 centimeter level. What are the dates? Well, you see on this core, I've actually put dates. How do I actually get that? Well, if I'm going back thousands of years, I use radiocarbon dating. Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The same thing archaeologists use. And so that's good for things of thousands of years old. But for the last 100, 150 years, we can't use radiocarbon. The half-life is too long, basically. But we have an isotope of lead, lead-210. It's in the uranium series, a naturally occurring isotope, always coming down. Lead-210 has a half-life of 22.2 years. So it's very effective for dating the last 100 years or so. So you can measure how much lead-210 is in the sediments. We do that with gamma counters we have in my lab. We measure how much lead-210 is in the sediments. Of course, every 22.2 years, there'll be half of it again lost. And by knowing the half-life, knowing how much is there, you can actually put dates on a sediment core like this. So this core was taken in 2010. That's the surface. This is about 1980. This is about 1840 here. As I did yesterday, I have a few things in Canadian history. There's 1867. That's when Canada became a country. Here's the last time the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. So you could put all sorts of major events of ancient history onto these types of cores. But you can actually put the dates on the core itself. Now you look at the mud and it looks just like mud. It is mud, but it's full of information. Our job is to tease apart the information that's in these sediment cores. And we do that usually using 2 major types of indicators. And this is for the biological indicators. There's also a spectrum of chemical indicators. But a morphological, basically the hard parts of organisms, and I'll show you a few examples in a minute. This is mainly done sitting in a microscope, looking at fossils, and biogeochemical things like fossil pigments and organic geochemistry. So there's a lot of information in those sediments. And one of the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today is what's actually coming in from the atmosphere. I'll be dealing with the oil sands. And I'm going to be dealing with, is there pollution that's coming somehow by an aerial transport to remote lakes? And basically that comes down to different types of things we can look at. We can actually look at the actual soot, if you like, or the black carbon coming out of different processes. Things like carbon particles from carbon combustion, fly ash from coal combustion. There are experts, including people who have gone through my lab, who can look at these black carbon particles and not just say it's something that's been burned, but they can say that's from oil. And there's even fancier things. You can actually fingerprint the chemistry and the isotopes in those particles and say, well, that's very high in vanadium. That's probably oil from Venezuela. You can actually start, by various methods, even fingerprinting where the pollution's coming from. And of course, there's a whole spectrum of metals, things like lead, zinc, cadmium, mercury, and a whole spectrum of other pollutants, DDT, PCBs. And the one example I'll be talking about here, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Many of the major contaminants we know about do find their way into lakes via the atmosphere through aerial transport, and are preserved in the sediment record in a way that's meaningful. There is, however, material coming in from the land, from the catchments. This is all part of the process. Lakes are complex. Where they have to, you can't divorce them from the land or from the atmosphere. Things like pollen grains that I spoke about earlier, mineral particles, soil particles, insect remains, all that's making its way into the sediment record. I'm a limnologist. I'm usually more interested in what's happening in the lake itself, and virtually everything living in that lake is leaving some sort of morphological or biogeochemical fossil. I talked about these yesterday, diatoms or algae, different types of algae. Many types of algal groups, especially diatoms, are extremely well preserved in lake sediments. And since different species live in very different environments, we can use that in a very quantitative way to reconstruct past environmental conditions. So for example, we can reconstruct what I talked about yesterday, how acid rain has affected lakes. Different species of diatoms are quite specific into which pHs they thrive at. Some thrive in very acid water, some in very alkaline water, some in circumneutral. We spent a long time cataloging this and determining this. We now have fairly quantitative transfer functions. By knowing the diatoms, we can say the pH was about 5.2, or given these diatoms, the pH was about 7.4. We can do that with phosphorus, a whole spectrum of issues. It's not just the botanical side or the algal side. The cladoscurs I talked about yesterday, things like the water fleas, they are also very important parts of ecosystems. They preserve again, not the whole organism, just they break typically into 3 different chitinous parts, but those parts are specific. It's a bit like archaeologists looking at bones and reconstructing what was there from the bones. Well, these are invertebrates, they don't have bones, but the exoskeleton falls apart, and there's experts who can look at the pieces of the exoskeleton and say which species it came from. And that includes things like insects. I use chironomids here as an example. The chironomid larvae are a very major part of the benthos of many lakes, and I'll be mentioning them in this talk as well. They are, unfortunately, the whole chironomid doesn't preserve. That'd be too easy. Just part of the head is heavily chitinized and very well preserved. And again, the dental patterns, I think it's like paleodentistry, but the mouth parts are quite specific to which group it's from. So by looking at the mouth parts, and again, a lot of work under the microscope, you can reconstruct which chironomid species were there. So the overall approach then is fairly straightforward. You have a lot of power when you're doing these types of methods. You can choose to study lake, which you could always do as a limnologist, but you can also choose the time scale. You can choose what type of core, how far back you want to go, how closely you want to date it, how you date it, which fossils or which indicators you want to look at. Very large step here on the microscope, and then you can analyze the data. So fairly straightforward procedure. The overall theme here is that lakes are sentinels of environmental change. Especially in Canada, lakes are almost everywhere in Canada. So you can do things on broad spatial scales, because there's so many of them, but also, and ecologists and limnologists can do things on broad spatial scales, but we can add the 3rd dimension of time. Because each of these lakes also has a history, we can go back in time. So we can look at these as sentinels of change both in space and in time. And that's what I'm going to do here in my example from the oil sands. I'm going to look at spatial and temporal scales. And I'm going to ask the question, is there any aerial transport of pollutants coming from the oil sands region development in the Athabasca region? And I refer to this as forensic Paleo Limnology because it is a bit like coming to the point after the fact. And I'll explain why we're coming to the point after fact. It's got to do with a variety of issues. But we ask the question, are current contaminant levels in shallow lakes near the Alberta oil sands natural? Now, it seems like an odd question. You can see some of these operations. You say, surely it isn't natural. But for a long time, there have been suggestions that, yes, you can go to the oil sands region. Yes, you can look at certain contaminant levels in lakes in the oil sand regions. Yes, they appear elevated, but they're elevated because they're naturally elevated. They're naturally elevated because the bitumen, or the stuff they're mining for the oil sands, is so close to the surface. And the argument was made, yes, it's higher, but it's always been higher. It's been higher for 10,000, 12,000 years. We know that bitumen's always been there, and it's slowly been leaking some of these chemicals. This, of course, was something that some people would be quite happy to believe. It means that we're not causing any problem by doing further extraction of the oil sand. Well, we asked this question. That has some, like everything else, every question has a history, and this also has a political history that I'll talk about a little bit to start with. But I think most of you know about the oil sands. It's a fairly common occurrence. The oil sands are in Western Canada and Northern Alberta. It's a big operation. The various estimates, but 170 billion barrels. It's using both surface mining and in situ mining, massive growth. And this is what the bitumen looks like. It's not oil. I mean, I was joking around at lunch, or you go to places like Kuwait or something, you kick the sand and out comes the oil. I know that's an exaggeration, but fairly easy to get at oil in some of these places in the Middle East. This is not simple oil. If you ever see bitumen, it's almost like asphalt or something, and it's quite remarkable what they can take from this and make oil out of it. But that's why it's also so expensive and so extensive in greenhouse gases and things like that. But it's a big deposit. There's no question there's a lot of money at stake. There's various estimates. Most people put it as the third largest reserve in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. I've seen some reports saying it's actually bigger than Venezuela, but I think most will put it down as third. We're talking about a major source of oil reserves. It's a big operation. You often see on websites something, it's this little dot on Canada. I put it on top of England, just to put some perspective. Now, it's true, not all of that is under complete development, as you see, like with the tailing ponds and everything. But to put some perspective, we're not talking about a small geographic region. We're talking about something that is about the size of England. And it's a big operation. I don't know if many of you have seen it, but I've never seen equipment so big. I mean, I've worked in mining camps and stuff when I was a student, but these are big trucks. You can't spit without seeing about 20 of them in some of these areas, so it is definitely a big operation. And it's already a very big operation in my view, and it's predicted to grow significantly. The industry itself is predicting anywhere from 2.5 to tripling of the industry in the next 15 or so years. So this is, I think, a key part of the story I'm going to be talking about here. I'm not saying that some of the pollution levels I'm going to be showing are enough to raise immediate alarm, but all you have to do is put what I'm going to tell you 3 times larger, and that's where I think the real story is coming from. And no question, it's a polarizing issue. You can't see a newspaper anywhere or without some sort of polarizing issues. These are just some of the news. Anyone who reads a newspaper or watches television, I don't think you can go a week without reading something about the oil sands. And it's a polarized view. It's a polarized view for a variety of reasons. There's big bucks to be made. There's estimated $300 billion in tax revenue alone. That's very hard for a government to say no to. North American energy security, jobs, jobs, jobs. All this is a major part of sort of on the plus side. On the negative side, it is a definitely resource-intensive production. We talk about greenhouse gas, we talk about everything. There's no question it's a resource-intensive. There are landscape disturbances. There's issues of water quantity and quality, pollution issues, and a remarkable number of First Nations issues. The oil sands operation is amidst a whole series of First Nations issues that adds even further complexity to what is already a very complex problem. And the question comes back is, well, is it natural? Well, this is a photograph going down the Athabasca River. If you go down the Athabasca River, you certainly can see where the argument can be made a lot of the pollution can be natural. I don't know how well you see it in this room, but you see that it's almost like black material, especially on a hot August day. It's like oozing out, almost weeping out of the sides of the riverbank. So there's definitely a significant source of bitumen very close to the surface. And so the argument is made that bitumen is so close to the surface that it is actually causing whatever you might see in the present day in higher levels, it's coming from the natural proximity, if you like, to the oil sands material. Well, there's many, many pollutants we can look at that potentially are coming from the oil sands. Again, because of time, I'm only going to focus on one, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. But my colleagues at Environment Canada, working with Josh Kirk and myself, Josh Kirk was a postdoc in my lab when we did this work. He's now a professor at Mount Allison. We are looking at a whole spectrum of metals, mercury, a lot of things. But because interest of time, realizing I had a set amount of time, I'm going to zero on the one. And I'm going to focus mainly on a paper that was published just over a year and a half ago with some new data we have afterwards. And we're going to look at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. A lot of interest in PAHs when it comes to petroleum industry. PAHs are, again, some complicated pollutants because they're both natural and anthropogenic. If you light a match, you release some PAHs. If you burn some toast this morning at breakfast, you release some PAHs. They come from natural burning of forest fires or anything. There's also PAHs coming in from the petrochemical industry and other industries. And they're a diverse group of compounds. There's about 100 or so, hundreds of them actually. Atmospheric deposition seems to be the key way to get them into aquatic ecosystems. And they're not nice things. I mean, the US EPA recognizes many of them as priority pollutants. They're listed in the Stockholm Convention and all these things. They've been associated with human health or with carcinogens, all sorts of things. So definitely people have grave, significant concerns over PAHs. The story has a history, like most environmental stories. I'm going to bring you back to a paper published by Aaron Kelly, now at the Northwest Territories government as a scientist. This story is often associated with David Schindler, who was a key player in the story. Many of you know Dave Schindler, but a host of other authors. They published a paper in 2009 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that made headlines pretty well around the world. They also looked at well, this is how the story begins. They looked at PAHs, and they asked the question, they asked the question, is the oil sands operation increasing PAHs in the vicinities of the places where potential releases are, such as this site, AR6, which is one of the major facilities in the middle of the oil sands. So they took this AR6 facility, and they used that sort of like the bullseye of a target, and then they went and they sampled snow samples. Now, snow also is accumulating a bit of a history, not like Lake Sediments over hundreds of years, but snow is accumulating whatever is accumulated up until that snow was melted. They used AR6 as sort of a bullseye, and they went in about 50 kilometers in different directions, and they took snow samples, and they melted down the snow sample. They looked, first of all, how much black carbon or soot is there, and I think you can see that there's quite a bit of soot in some of these. This doesn't look like natural snow samples, especially near the AR6. But they also looked at PAHs and other things, but I'm going to focus on PAHs here. They looked at these pollutants in these snow samples. And what they found is that pollution levels were much higher when you got closer to the middle of the target of AR6, and they dissipated as you got farther and farther away from the oil sands. Well, they went actually farther than 50 kilometers, but they found certainly effects that they believed were linked to the AR6 of the oil sands operation about 50 kilometers away from the middle of the bullseye, if you like. They published this, and that in itself was interesting, I think, but they went a bit further. These results were quite contrary to the ongoing monitoring programs that were going on in the oil sands region. In the oil sands region, there was a monitoring program called RAMP going on. It was going on for at this point probably about 14 years or so. It was a monitoring program funded and run basically by the industries as part of their commitment to the oil sands. It had a relatively small budget. And the point is the RAMP was not seeing any trends in pollutants or any significant trends in pollutants. This was obviously very different from the data that was coming from most of the RAMP, from most of the ongoing monitoring programs. And perhaps not surprisingly, when this paper hit the headlines, and it hit the headlines, there was a major, shall we say, a meeting of different views on what's happening in the oil sands. These views were contrary to the general view held by the industrial stakeholders, and immediately the study was heavily criticized. It was criticized for a variety of reasons. One of the big things it was criticizing, it was a snapshot. You just looked at snow samples in February. It's not representative. You can't, sort of condemn the whole monitoring program because of that. And of course, any of you who know Dave Schindler, Dave Schindler is a friend of mine, but he reminds me of a wall. If you hit him, I think he just walls even further back. Was giving a large number of interviews, and they wrote right in the paper, these results indicate that major changes are needed to the way that environmental impacts of oil sands development are monitored and managed. They took an immediate shot at the RAMP, or the industrial-sponsored monitoring program that was going on at the time. Now, this really raised a lot of, it was in the news. I'm sure this is going back 2009, but I'm sure if you were around then, you would have heard it in newspapers, in CBC, Evans, it was everywhere on the CBC. This raised concerns to such a point that the then Minister of the Environment, who was Prentice, the current Premier of Alberta, was then the Minister of the Environment. And he named a 6-person panel to investigate the monitoring program that's going on in the oil sands region. He said, well, we have to settle this. I mean, it's just not, people yelling at each other aren't going to settle it. He named, to his credit, named a 6-person panel. It was chaired by Liz Dowdeswell, who is the current Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. I was on the 6-person panel, as well as other people you might know, like Peter Dillon. And we were charged in about 90 days to investigate the oil sands monitoring program and see is it quality, or is it actually a world-class monitoring program, or what's wrong? Why can Dave Schindler come out with very different results as the monitoring program? Well, our results were pretty scathing. The report's online. You can read what we wrote in our 50 or so page report. We'd certainly identified there were many shortcomings in the ongoing monitoring program. Not necessarily the fault of the people doing the monitoring. They were consultants doing what they were told, but there were whole issues of timescales, the methodology they were using, the geographic scope. They did not see a trend. It would be very hard to see a trend, would be my view, based on the data. I always love this photograph. That's Liz Dowdeswell. And by the time the report came out, John Baird was Minister of the Environment. This is at our press conference where we released the document. I love this photograph. It's like Liz is watching every word former Queen's graduate John Baird is saying. Anyway, so the report came out. It was pretty scathing. This resulted in a series of other panels. I was on 2 of them to set up, quote, the mandate was to advise on how to set up a world-class monitoring program. And this is the report we tabled for the water, but there was one for the air that was also on, and a few other things. And basically we said there are problems with the ongoing monitoring program, and you've missed the window. I mean, oil sands is already a major operation. How are you going to, you're not going to get at background conditions based on the monitoring that was done today. So basically, this is the problem you have with timescales. This is going back, I'm only going back a century, which is nothing in ecological history, but basically oil sands started in a significant way in 1968, but they really ramped up since 1980, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years. The issue is that the ramp, which is the monitoring program, and there was, of course, many issues we said with the monitoring, but the monitoring program only occurs this time scale here. What you really need to know is what were the pollution levels here, what were the pollution levels here, what were the pollution levels in the early 1900s. And on top of that, there's 190% growth estimated to happen since then. So you put these dots and you wonder, by knowing what's happened in the past, you might have a better idea of what's going to be happening in the future. So the same questions I kind of put out. The question that could not be answered from the monitoring is, what is natural in this ecosystem? And have conditions changed? How much, fast, when? And perhaps more importantly, if they have changed, why? Is it because of the oil industry in the region? And this resulted in the paper we published, I guess, just a year and a half ago or so. And Josh Couric, who's now was a postdoc, now a professor at Mount St. Vincent, mainly all the chemical data I'm talking about were primarily our co-authors, as I said, Jane Kirk, Derek Muir, Zhao Wang, and Marlene Evans. And the work was done largely in my lab. I'm going to focus a bit on the chemical side, but I'm also going to talk about the biological consequences of this. And again, here's the issue. There's the monitoring program. We said, if you want to do this, if you want to get to background, the only way you can get at it now is with Paleo Limnology. And this is what I'll be talking about. The general thing is that shallow lakes, and many shallow lakes in the area, relatively high surface area to volume ratios. And my argument is every time you see these shallow lakes, it's a passive sampler. It's been sampling the environment for you, and you can do this on a spatial scale. So we go back to using the same sort of model design as the Schindler paper did. There's AR6, the center of the bullseye. Now, we did not do 50 or 70 lake cores because lake core work is quite labor intensive and expensive. What we did is we did 5 ponds near the development area within 50 kilometers and one called Namer Lake, which was about 90 kilometers away. We chose, we don't want to confuse the signal, so we used undisturbed catchments, simple basins. We didn't want anything with other roads or things around. We want to go into the wilderness 50 kilometers away and just use these lakes as passive samplers. And the argument is that these lakes are going to reflect atmospheric deposition and contaminants from the upgrader. So a similar design to the Schindler paper I was talking about, except there's the AR6. And of course, there's different wind patterns too. The wind is primarily going in this direction. So distance from AR6 and the wind patterns should result in very different histories of PAHs if, in fact, the oil industry is passing on the PAHs. Here's just perhaps an easier way to look at it. There's the wind pattern. So these lakes were carefully chosen. One of them is 90 kilometers away. Well, first question, are they natural? Well, here are the PAHs from the lake that's closest to the refiner. I think most people would argue this is not a straight line. What we have here is going back to the 1800s. This is the total amount of PAHs. They start seeing increase in 1968 or thereabouts. That's an interesting time. That's when the oil sands operation began. And really ramping up to the present time. This has increased 23 times background levels. Now, as you go farther away, you would expect less and less. And if you get out of the major wind patterns, less and less. But all the lakes show on average increases going anywhere from 2.5 to 23 times. For example, here's one. This is AR6. I'll show you them all. This is southeast of AR6. This is northwest 35. As you get farther in on different parts of wind patterns, the thing changes in pattern. But you put all our cores together, all the PAHs together, and you put them on with Z-scores, as I've done here, I think it is quite clear. 2, you see a big increase, no matter where the cores are from. And if you do a breakpoint analysis, it pretty well hits right on 1968 when the oil sands operation began. I think we had the smoking gun. It is not natural. They are coming from the oil sands operation. And I think this is kind of the figure that you need to show that. You can reconstruct the stuff that's missing in the past. Now, our colleagues can get a little fancier. As I said, there's many types of PAHs out there. Can you fingerprint the PAHs, not just to overall PAHs, can you fingerprint them to the oil sands operation? And again, I'm certainly not a chemist, and I'm not the one who did these analyses, but by looking at the types of PAHs, you can zero in on where it's coming from. And they have done this. We did this and looked at this in various ways. Here's the same figure I just showed you. So the timing is very suspiciously 1968. These are PAHs of oil sands of DBTs, which are more or less specific to the petroleum industry in the area. Not only is the total amount of PAHs increasing, but the type of PAHs are, again, totally consistent with the oil sands development. We also were surprised to see, to some extent, that we also appear to have a recognizable signal in Namer Lake. Namer Lake's 90 kilometers away. And we don't see anywhere nearly as strong a signal. But if you look at total PAHs, this is it here, it still increases on average about 3 times over background conditions. The question was asked in a comment and reply that came from that PNAS paper that this could probably be from natural sources, forest fires, and so on. What we did to reply to that comment, we looked much more closely at what the PAHs are. And sure enough, if you look at PAHs that come from forest fires, like retine, if anything, it's a straight line, or if anything, they've actually been slightly decreasing over the time period. This is consistent with PAHs in many remote lakes. They're actually decreasing over time because forest fires have been much more controlled. Forest fires as a source of natural PAHs. If, however, you look at the PAHs specific to the oil sands or restricted to the oil sands, they are the ones that are contributing much to this increase. So I think, although far less striking as the sites closest to the AR6, I think still the argument can be made that on average we are seeing a signal even 90 kilometers away. So the footprint of the disturbance might be farther than initially thought. Is lake biology changing? I mean, I've talked a lot about chemistry. I start off this talk by showing about all the different types of indicators we can use. And what we're trying to do is develop this field of what we're referring to as Paleo Ecotoxicology. I know you have many toxicologists here. But usually you do toxicology in the lab and you do chemicals and you try and find out what's happening. Well, since we can reconstruct past stressors, in this case like PAHs and other things, and since we can also reconstruct what past biological communities have been, we can actually see what have been the effects of past stressors going back in time. And that's about the only way you can actually do this in this world. So I won't have much time to talk about that here, but we looked at everything from Cladostra like Daphnia, which is a major ecotoxicological indicator, primary producers like diatoms and chlorophyll A, different insects. Much of my lab is now doing that in the same material and to try and find out. And so here's just a nutshell. This is preliminary data, but here's just a nutshell of what's happening. First of all, we're seeing algal production is increasing in all the cores. We can reconstruct past algal production using fossil chlorophyll A. And we see algal production increasing in all cores. The question is, what's causing that? Well, there's different reasons you can have it. One could be climate change, because with climate warming, you have less ice cover. With less ice cover, you have more light, more chance for production. We've shown this in many parts of the world. The summer is getting longer. There's more time for algal production. You get more algal production. Is it possibly also aerial deposition of nutrients? We haven't really dealt into this completely, but there is a notice that the sites that appear to be closer to the oil sands, based on our preliminary data, seem to have some of the biggest changes in chlorophyll A. Now, there could be other reasons for that too. The black carbon coming from the oil sands could be decreasing the albedo, increasing mixing. But this is something that could be investigated because it's possible there's nutrients also coming from the aerial disposition from the soil sands. The way we can get at that is diatoms and chrysophytes. The algal fossils are pretty good indicators of nutrients. So one of the things we're looking at in these cores is, can we see changes in past nutrient status in time using these algal indicators? We can also look at the particulates. Part of my lab is looking at really the black carbon, the actual looking at the particles that are coming out of the smokestacks or the various types of industrial activities and characterizing them. So we can actually look at these various stresses over time. So these are not really black boxes. Although no one was measuring particulate deposition in the past, you can actually get it with some of these types of analyses. I'll just show you a bit of the Daphnia. The Daphnia, as many of you probably in the room know, Daphnia or cladostridans are major indicators used in ecotoxicological work. It's one of the generally approved indicators. And we asked the question, since Daphnia are sensitive to many contaminants, do we see as yet any negative impacts in the fossil cladostridans in concert with the oil sands development? So we're going to look at Daphnia. Of course, not like in ecotoxicology, we'll look at the total Daphnia. We're going to look at the bits and pieces that we can reconstruct past environmental change. And the general story is that there's no consistent pattern yet, we do not see any consistent pattern with a decrease in Cladostria. In fact, we see Daphnia increasing. We see Daphnia increasing at the same time the algal production, or probably related to the algal production increasing. So possibly because of climate, possibly because of fertilization, algal production is well documented now and increasing. We're seeing the Daphnia actually increasing well. Probably warmer conditions, better food source is one possibility. It's important to also say that we should not really expect much change in the biology yet. I have said the PAHs have increased 23 times. I am not saying that the contaminant levels in the oil sands lakes has reached a critically high level. The levels that we see in some of our more contaminated sites have about the same contaminant levels as a lake would if it was in downtown Toronto, let's say. So we're not at that level yet. The issue to keep in mind, though, is that even the industry's estimates are at about a tripling of the oil sands operation within the next 15 or so years. If you start putting those numbers and increase them by that type of range, then you are getting past some of the probable effects levels and other things that people are doing. Only our most impacted site has reached the interim levels of the Canadian Sediment Water Quality Guidelines. And again, these are wilderness lakes, so it's not what you'd expect. So that's what we're saying. When we looked at the chironomids, or the insect fossils, another ecotoxicological tool, this is again is preliminary, but there certainly does appear to be a shift in direction in the chironomids, and a shift in direction, at least on these preliminary data, towards taxa that are less sensitive to that are prone to be changing with pollution. So we do see some in these preliminary data, the benthic insect fossils appear to be moving in that direction. So, are the elevated pH concentrations natural? I got these from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and Alberta government website. This is not actually how I tend to see when I go to the oil sands, but these are the pictures you get. I think our data show that the pH concentrations are not natural. They have increased significantly since that time. I mean, actually, when I go to the oil sands, that's kind of what it looks like to me, and it reminds me a little bit of Mordor, but it's not. I don't see that on the website. But I think we have to also realize that I think these are important data. I think these histories lessons, if you like, are important, and I think we also have to realize that this is such a polarized debate in many ways. We have to be, if you're a scientist doing this, you have to be ready for a fight. There's a lot at stake financially, and it can get nasty. And I'll just use one example, and I can give you many from my own personal views, but some of us talked about this. Some of you saw this. It was released in August or September of this year. A journalist, Tom Korski, used access of information documents to see if, and I'm not sure what he was fishing for, but he apparently was fishing for the name John Smol in access to information documents in the federal government. And he phoned me. I was on a trip in Halifax, and he says, I'd like to talk to you about some things I found with access of information. And there was a fairly long memo written, among other things, by the then Deputy Minister to the Minister of Natural Resources. And it appeared to be looking at our paper and the media coverage of our paper. When our paper was published, we probably did about 100 media interviews. This really did go, pretty well around the world. We did 2 interviews in Chinese television. I did German television, Swedish television. It went everywhere. And what was remarkable about this paper is when you look at this memo, they're not actually criticizing in any way, as I can see, any of the science we did. And of course, criticism of science is how we move forward. It's the oxygen that moves science forward is criticism. That wasn't in this document. The biggest concern seems to be that apparently I gave, quote, advanced briefings on the paper. As many of you know, you publish paper in Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It has an embargo on it, which this paper, of course, had an embargo on it. It had an embargo of like Tuesday at 7 o'clock when the media can actually release it to the public. The media, the journal publication also sends it to the media 5 days in advance, as a standard practice, with the embargo on it, so that people can do interviews before the media embargo is lifted. And everyone in the media knows that, and I would have thought everyone in the government should know this. But what apparently was I showed a lack of neutrality. John Smol was showing a lack of neutrality and showed bias, was another word used, because I gave advanced media interviews. There seems to be a real disconnect as to how science is done. Let's just call it what it is. This is how science is done. You use publicly used money, and then you make an effort, if the public is interested in it, to go and talk about it in a way that is meaningful to the people who paid for it in the first place. And this is all that I was doing. I did exactly, not one of the 100 media outlets broke the media embargo. It was released when it was supposed to be released. I'd love to know what type of Rolodex they think I have on my desk that I can phone German or Swedish or Chinese television stations. Obviously, the media called me. I did my job as a university professor in responding in a way that was meaningful to them. And to claiming that you have bias or lack of neutrality because you try and actually explain the contents of your work, I think we have an issue. I think, so just be ready for a fight. There's a lot of things here at stake. So I would just conclude by saying that unlike many other remote lakes of North Central America, many remote lakes' pHs are actually decreasing because of forest fire control. Here we have them increasing anywhere from 2.5 to 23 times. The timing and pattern of changes are completely consistent with the oil sands operation, and moreover, the composition of the pHs clearly identify local petroleum operations as the root source. Is as a concern, again, I'm not being alarmist. I'm not saying the pollution levels are so extraordinarily high, but I might argue that what we're showing is a best case scenario. Lake sediments average material over different periods of time. Very often those pollutants can come in pulses, for example, when the snow melts. So at certain times of the year, they're coming in at much higher time than on average. So that might be something that people have to look at. Secondarily, I just talked about pHs. I don't think we can be naive to think that's the only thing coming out of those stacks. Out of the various operations, there's different types of metals, different times. On top of that, you put climate change. So we're dealing in a multiple stressor world. Having said that, though, it's forecasted to nearly triple in the next 20 years. That is, I think, what the main focus of this talk is about. This is the thin edge of the wedge of a problem that's rapidly developing, and something I think has to be done about it. So in conclusion, Paleo Limnology provides a valuable perspective on oil sands development and regional environmental change. I think it's capable of establishing environmental baselines. This is one of the biggest things we have in water-related research. We don't have the baselines. This was one of the biggest problems when we went and sat down with that 6-person committee to try and find out how to deal with the oil sands. We didn't have the baselines. Paleo Limnology can do that. And from what we're seeing, it appears to be slowly moving to new ecological states in this multiple stressor world. Some of that's climate change probably, some of that is the oil sands development, but we are moving to new ecological states. And I think this shows is that we have to just start having a more balanced view. We can't just keep going, it's the economy versus the environment. Obviously, as everyone I think in this audience knows, the environment and the economy are the same thing. The economy is based on the environment, is the foundation of the environment. And you see ads like this, what do the oil sands mean? Well, hospitals, doctors. Well, good, we're going to need more hospitals and doctors if this keeps going. But I mean, yes, of course, there's the positive sides. I mean, there's obviously a financial gain to a lot of this. But we also have to balance it with some of the negative impacts that are coming from this. And so just to conclude, I think what I hope I showed is this field of Paleo Limnology. Most people thought like monitoring is in days, seasons, possibly years. And they think of paleo, they think of thousands of years or maybe centuries. But with these new methodologies, new techniques, you can actually dovetail the two approaches. And as I hope I showed you today, it's usually where the dovetailing of the two approaches, that's where a lot of the answers lie hidden. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great talk, John. Thanks.
Thank you.
Question, did you do any sort of related work to determine spikes in industrial production or oil production at the same time? Was there any additional work in that regard?
I should say, thank you, asking any additional work in spikes and different periods like that. I should say, I'll preface the question by saying, I only show you the results sort of out to date. Partly this was streamlined and partly it hasn't been published. We now have over 20 cores that we're looking at in a much broader geographic focus. So we're getting a much better spatial scale. The question you're asking is on a temporal scale. We did not look at specific spikes because the paleo record isn't really that strong. If we had some annually laminated sediments or varved sediments, there's a potential of looking for very specific things. But our dating isn't that good. I mean, we know the surface is the date we took the core. There are definitely errors in the dating approach of a few years, so it'd be very hard to correlate it in that respect. So no, we haven't. The probably easiest thing is to do kind of what we did, this much increase over background and stuff like that.
Sure.
Sorry, just to follow up then. So you've completed a lot of work to date. Is there expectation or perhaps a hope that there will be further testing in other lakes in the area?
Yes, there actually, as I said, I was involved in trying to help, quote, a world-class monitoring program. I'm certainly giving a benefit of the doubt. They've hired some outstanding people into the new monitoring program. The budget has significantly been increased. There's no question they've hired some very good people, people who certainly are qualified to make a world-class monitoring program. The devil, of course, is in the details of, is the funding going to continue? Is it going to continue on in a way that's like that? But there's definitely have been major changes since our report has been tabled. And so that, so far, as I say, whenever the media asked me a lot about this question, I said, well, I'm obviously giving them the benefit of the doubt. And they've done some very positive things so far. But again, the evidence will be in 5-6 years. Yeah.
So who's they?
Well, that's a good question. It's very, you almost need a scorecard. And I should know this better, but it started off, there's a few organizations that are monitoring this. The Amura program, Alberta Monitoring, oh boy.
Alberta Environmental Monitoring, Evaluating and Reporting
Agency.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know there are hundreds of acronyms. They're certainly now becoming, so if I get, again, I'm not 100% sure if I'm saying this accurately, but my impression is they're sort of coalescing into the major group there, I think. Yeah. And so they're capturing other, there may have been maybe the feds and stuff. So my impression that's happening there. But there's also some other types of monitoring, like the wood buffalo.
Right. So I understand, this organization is new. It's just being
coming online now.
It's an arm's length agency of the Alberta government. So it's receiving funding, but the politicians or decision makers can't meddle with it. And it will be responsible for monitoring all the environmental monitoring throughout the entire province, and it's setting up to focus on the oil sands region first before it takes over everything in the province. And many of the people who were part of the joint oil sands monitoring or Alberta environment are moving in and building that up. Yeah.
They just named a new director, head who very well respected from Environment Canada. They've pulled in people from other groups. So as an outsider, I'll give them certainly kudos for what they've done so far. But the proof will be has to be in 10 years, and I'll have no hair left. And
Thought I saw some other hands go up.
So you have, John, wonderful talk. You have these other changes that are going on, this apparent trophic enrichment. Are you pursuing that and trying to get a handle on what's going on?
Yeah, definitely the ongoing work. A lot of this is students' work in progress, and frankly, with live streaming, I don't want to show too much unpublished data because we haven't really vetted it. And but we're definitely looking at we're looking in maybe over 20 cores now. We're looking at the invertebrate fossils, the diatoms, the chlorophyllae, the black carbon, and doing all these types of, plus our Environment Canada colleagues are doing the stressors, if you like, the PAHs, the metals. And we're definitely, I think we can tease that apart. I mean, if we see the same type of change in chlorophyllae on the windward side, there's a wind pattern, there's a distance pattern, I think we can say it's mostly climate change. Because we definitely have seen increases in chlorophyllae in many parts of the world linked to climate change. If we see far bigger changes as we get closer to the oil sands development, I think that definitely links it, some enhancement, if you like, to the oil sands development, and we can do that. And since we're also looking at black carbon and particulates, I think we can even start getting at the causes. Is it actually coming in the particulates and so on? So I think there's a lot we can do. And then also looking at some of it may not be related to nutrients, like the chironomids may be responding directly to different types of contaminants. But that's where we work with the ecotoxicology. This is kind of a new area. We're kind of want to work with ecotoxicologists, but go back in time, so we're calling it Paleo Ecotoxicology. But it's all coming, massive amount of data. It's a little daunting how many cores we have, and put it together. One of my PhD students, one of her goals will to do paleo atlases. She has a master's in planning, and to just show this type of data, because partly our data are not easy to look at, as you know. But there's an idea of maybe doing paleo atlases going back in time, and looking, this is what the oil sands look like in the 1800s with metals and and biology, and then you can almost flip it or electronically flip it and do a time series. Because we're trying to show broad spatial scales, but also broad temporal scales. So we have another dimension that you mostly don't normally have in a limnological study. So.
Yeah, I love how you do your hand signal for broad temporal scales.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when you talk about time scales, you don't often talk to ecologists. This is, we have a real long-term monitoring of 5 years or something, which is commendable. But I have a different view of what long means.
Hi. So thank you again for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
You said if you're doing research that might be policy relevant, and it's going to be contentious, that you should get ready for a fight. And I was wondering what you should do to get ready for a fight. Partly because, you found out about this story about someone making claims that you were improperly behaving because you were doing what all scientists are supposed to do. Very odd. Were there any other ramifications? In the U.S. you have scientists now who get slapped with Freedom of Information Acts, and they have to produce all the data or all the emails that they have given in the last 3 years on the topic. What kinds of things do you do to be ready for those fights?
Well, I think what I want to try and do, especially with many young people in the audience, don't be intimidated. That was the first thing I'd want to say. But you have to be, don't pretend everything will be the same as before. There are, to some extent, you need a thick skin. I mean, you can Google John Smol and you can see a whole lot of things on the internet. Not all of them complimentary. Eco-fascist. The list goes on and on. And it shouldn't intimidate people. If we're intimidated, that's if you're intimidated, they've won basically. And I think, frankly, that's what's happening in some issues. I think you have to be by ready for a fight. I would say, I would just give the basic science advice I would give to any student or someone I'm trying to mentor is stick to the facts. As you're a scientist, stick to what you know, stick to the facts, realize that people will be ready to try and move the information in any way they want, which is maybe human nature, but there's ways you can decrease that possibility by being careful on how you speak and how you write. And if the facts are perfectly clear and honest, which have to be honest, I think that can solve a lot of issues. Try not to get too emotional would be another piece of advice for getting ready to fight. And it's sometimes hard to do, I agree. But try not to get too emotional when you're like if you're on in the debate on radio or something. Don't sink to their levels. there is a real tendency to do that sometimes, I think. And sometimes, when you are in one of these contentious situations, you just, you're almost exasperated. I don't know, what can I possibly say? And I think you just have to realize that, there may be contentious issues, and if you're not of the personality ready to take it, well, then maybe change to what you do or something. But I don't want people to do that, but it will not necessarily be all smooth sailing, and be ready to, the costs are not so much, I really don't care what they say anymore, but a lot of people do. Be prepared that it's going to take some time, because you have to, it's the classic. If something's said in a significant way and above that, I'm not even going to respond, I know exactly what the next one is. Oh, Smol is too scared to debate this issue, and that happens all the time. Or he's obviously, by non-responding, he agrees. So you can't just let things slide. You have to be careful. You have to decide, pick your battles too. But you can't just let it slide. You have to realize that there could also be negative repercussions to some of these things. Never mind in your time, but some people argue you might need to get a tax lawyer. I won't get into that. But I mean, and there's also sometimes, unfortunately, some ramifications from some members of your colleagues who don't think let's say university professors should be doing this. There's still not as much. When I was a student, younger, when I started in acid rain, I was already doing stuff like this, and I know people did not like that I was doing, because that's not what a university professor does. I know it was called tooting your own horn. They come up with any stupid thing to say about it. It wasn't tooting your own horn. You had found stuff that was important that the public should know, and there was still, in my, the generation ahead of me, and I'm not casting a complete shadow, but there was definitely some of that. I know my PhD supervisor would have been horrified if 30 years ago, if he saw the way I'm doing media interviews and stuff. It just wasn't what we do at Queen's University kind of thing, That's changed a lot. I mean, and universities have changed a lot in this manner too. I mean, we have communications department, which they didn't have then. They try and get the message out, because one of the biggest issues with universities, people don't think they're relevant. They try and make them sound relevant. But there is a cost to that too, and there's a time commitment. There's a frustration commitment. So, but just be ready. It's not just you're not just going to publish some of these and give a press release and they go, okay, now I'm going home. Or I mean, you could do that, but it's not the way. So there is some cost associated with that.
All right, we got one more question. Okay, starting to get long here, but we'll take one more.
I think when I look at your title, the sediment is a natural archive of the history of many things of the earth. And if you look at that way, actually, if you ever look at a cliff, the layers of soil of different layers in the mountains, those were settlements of yesterday. So the natural has a real archive. And how one dig into it, of course, depending on your discipline, your diligence, and your wisdom. I think that idea, where did you get that idea that this is a natural archive?
Oh, yeah. Well, it wasn't totally my idea, but I can take credit for it. No, people have been looking at sediments. It started primarily, I think, in the oceans, in the deep drilling projects. And people are obviously realizing for some time that as you go deeper into sediments, you have an archive. What really happened in my generation's time, where I'm talking, I think, the thin sectioning of the cores I talked about, the idea that you can get a detail to this. Going back, in the 1940s, 1950s, some people have already worked on, peat bogs and did long-term changes by mud at the bottom of a lake. To get it detailed over the last 100, 150 years, that's definitely sort of my generation time. And a lot of that work was done when I was starting. First you needed a core to do it, then you needed a way to section it. Then you had to convince even your paleo-type colleagues that you could do this. There was still this idea that, it's too mixed, you'll never get a surface core. So, we started basically, this is late 70s, early 80s really is when, with acid rain, a lot of this started. That'd be mid to late 80s where we really saw a need for doing these types of analyses. So there was many people, especially in Western Europe. England was a major area doing this. parts of the United States and parts of Canada, including this university. Hamish Duthie was a professor here. He was one of the first Paleo Limnologists. Hamish has retired, I think, some years ago.
And Paul Caro's here.
Oh, Paul Caro. Paul Caro's here. You can add to this too, Paul. but I mean, really, the fine interval stuff is really, to a large extent, the last 30 years, you know? And I know when I started my master's in Algonquin Park to try and show, I made a core that would take a surface core and I sectioned it 1 centimeter, which then was considered really high resolution, to try and show the effect of a highway, and I could show it. But I remember some of the biggest criticism was from there weren't many paleo people at the time, but it was, oh, you're trying to push the techniques too far. People kept looking at what the techniques can't do. I always try and prompt my students, stop telling me what your data can't tell you. Tell me what your data can tell you, and look at it from there. And we found out, I think, over history, that we can do an awful lot with the paleo record.
All right, I think we've probably gone well over 3:30, and intervening on the time that John will have at the grad house with the Swigs group.
It's terrible.
finally get something to drink. But as a token of appreciation for your very interesting talk that stimulated lots of good discussion, it's a gift from the Water Institute.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for coming.